Sometimes you have to wonder how 31 years can disappear in a single night. I mean, I thought I had everything figured out. A devoted husband, 4 grown kids who actually call us, financial stability, and this amazing connection to my Greek heritage that made me feel special in ways Allan never quite understood. But here's the thing about feeling special. Sometimes it makes you do things that change everything. Anyway, make sure to hit that like button if you enjoy my videos. And don't forget to subscribe if you're new here. I'm Lindsay. I'm 53, and I've been married to Allan for what feels like forever. He's 54, works in some technical field that pays the bills but never really excited me. And after all these years, he still can't speak Greek fluently. I know that sounds harsh, but come on. 31 years married to a Greek woman, and you can't even hold a conversation with my relatives. It's embarrassing, really. Allan has always been this overly accommodating type. You know, the kind of guy who says, whatever makes you happy when I ask where we should go for dinner, then sits there looking lost when I drag him to Greek functions where he can't understand half the conversations. He tries, I'll give him that. But there's something so insufficient about watching him nod politely while my cousins are telling hilarious stories in Greek that he'll never get. Our marriage wasn't terrible or anything. We raised 4 wonderful kids together. Lucas and Connor are both doing well for themselves now. We had our routines, our comfortable life, our financial stability. But comfortable isn't the same as exciting. And after 3 decades of watching Allan fumble through Greek pronunciations and sit awkwardly at cultural events, I started feeling like I was carrying this beautiful part of myself that he'd never truly appreciate. The Greek community here has always been my sanctuary. The church functions, the social club events, the festivals, these are where I feel most like myself. Allan comes along because that's what husbands do. But I can see it in his face sometimes. This glazed over look like he's enduring something rather than enjoying it. And look, I get it. Being the only non-Greek person in a room full of people rapid-firing in a language you don't understand can't be fun. But after 31 years, shouldn't he have tried harder? I've always been proud of how well I've maintained my Greek identity. My parents immigrated here when I was young, but they made sure I stayed connected to our culture, our language, our traditions. It's something that sets me apart from other wives in our neighborhood. I have this rich, ancient heritage flowing through my veins, while they're all just American. Allan married into something extraordinary when he married me, even if he's never fully grasped that. The social club we belong to hosts these amazing events throughout the year. Traditional dinners with authentic Greek music, dancing, the works. Allan always comes with me because, well, that's what we do. We're a couple, we attend things together. But I can't help noticing how he sits there picking at his moussaka while everyone around us is having these animated conversations in Greek, laughing at jokes he'll never understand, sharing memories from the old country that he has no connection to. Sometimes I catch myself feeling almost sorry for him. Here's this man who's devoted 31 years of his life to me, and he's still on the outside of something that's so fundamentally part of who I am. But then I remember he chose this. He chose to marry a Greek woman, and he chose not to fully embrace what that meant. I can't be responsible for his lack of cultural curiosity. Our kids grew up bilingual, switching effortlessly between English and Greek depending on which grandparent they were talking to. They understand the jokes, they know the stories, they feel connected to something bigger than themselves. Allan watches all of this from the sidelines like some kind of permanent guest in his own family's cultural life. I've tried over the years to help him feel more included. I've translated conversations, explained cultural references, encouraged him to take language classes. But there's only so much you can do for someone who seems content to remain perpetually on the periphery. After a while, you stop trying so hard and just accept that some people are happy being spectators. The latest function was supposed to be just another evening out. The club had hired this photographer to document the event, someone named Dennis, who apparently grew up in the same neighborhood as several of the older members. I wasn't expecting anything different from our usual routine. Allan and I would sit together, I'd translate the important bits of conversation for him, he'd smile politely and nod in all the right places, and we'd go home. But when Dennis sat down next to me at dinner, something shifted. Here was someone who immediately started speaking to me in fluent Greek, someone who understood the cultural references and laughed at the right moments, someone who got the jokes without needing them explained. For the first time in years, I felt like I was having a real conversation with someone who existed in my world, not someone I had to constantly translate for. Dennis had this easy confidence about him, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you fit. He knew the families, understood the community dynamics, could trace the connections between different members going back generations. When he talked about growing up in the old neighborhood, I could picture every street he mentioned. When he referenced cultural traditions, he wasn't asking for explanations. He was sharing memories. I found myself getting completely absorbed in our conversation. Here was someone who could match my cultural knowledge, who understood the subtle social hierarchies within the Greek community, who appreciated the complexity of maintaining heritage in America. Allan sat beside us, occasionally trying to interject with questions about what we were discussing. But how do you explain 30 years of shared cultural understanding to someone who's never lived it? The more Dennis and I talked, the more I realized how starved I'd been for this kind of connection. All those years of dumbing down conversations for Allan, of translating not just language, but entire cultural concepts, of feeling like I was performing my Greek identity rather than simply living it. With Dennis, I could just be myself without explanation or accommodation. Allan kept trying to engage with us, asking what we were talking about, requesting translations, but the conversations were flowing so naturally in Greek, touching on so many cultural nuances, that stopping to explain everything would have killed the momentum entirely. I started giving him shorter and shorter responses, just community stuff or old neighborhood stories, hoping he'd get the hint and let me enjoy this rare opportunity to connect with someone from my world. I could see Allan getting frustrated, but what did he expect? This was exactly what every other Greek function had been like for him. The difference is that this time I'd found someone who could actually keep up with me, someone who didn't need me to slow down or simplify or translate, someone who made me remember what it felt like to have conversations that didn't require constant cultural translation. When the dancing started, Dennis asked me to join him. It felt so natural. Finally, a partner who knew the steps, who understood the rhythm, who could lead properly instead of fumbling through approximations like Allan always did. We moved together like we'd been dancing for years. And I remembered what it felt like to feel graceful and confident on the dance floor, instead of constantly adjusting for a partner who was always half a beat behind. Allan stayed at our table watching. I could feel his eyes on us, but I was having too much fun to care. When was the last time I danced with someone who actually knew what they were doing? When was the last time I'd felt this connected to my culture, this proud of my heritage, this comfortable in my own skin? Between dances, Dennis and I ended up at the bar sharing stories over traditional Greek spirits. He knew exactly what to order, knew the proper toasts, understood the significance of each drink. We talked about family histories, about the old country, about the challenges of maintaining Greek identity in modern America. Everything Allan and I had never been able to discuss because he simply didn't have the foundation to understand. I lost track of time completely. For once, I wasn't watching the clock, wondering when Allan would start giving me those subtle signals that he was ready to leave. I wasn't managing his comfort level or making sure he felt included. I was just enjoying myself in a way I hadn't in years. When Allan came over to ask when we were leaving, I felt this flash of irritation. Couldn't he see I was finally having a good time? Couldn't he just let me enjoy this one evening of feeling culturally connected? I told him we'd leave in 15 minutes. I just needed to wrap up my conversation with Dennis and say goodbye to a few people. But then Dennis mentioned something about an after-party at the club president's house, a smaller gathering for club officials and special guests. Exactly, the kind of intimate cultural event I'd been craving, the kind of evening where the real conversations happen, where the community bonds are strengthened, where you feel like you're part of something meaningful instead of just attending something. I didn't even think about Allan. The invitation was clearly for me. Dennis made that obvious by the way he phrased it, by the way he looked at me when he mentioned it. This was my opportunity to finally be part of the inner circle of our Greek community, to spend an evening with people who truly understood my world. I stepped outside to get some air and think about whether I should go. This was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been waiting for, a chance to deepen my connections within the Greek community, to be seen as more than just another member's wife, to be valued for my cultural knowledge and heritage. When would I get another chance like this? By the time I decided to go, I couldn't find Allan anywhere. He wasn't at our table, wasn't in the main hall, wasn't in the bathroom. I tried calling him, but my phone was acting up. I figured he'd probably stepped outside for a cigarette or was talking to someone in another part of the building. The after party was starting soon, and I didn't want to miss any more of it looking for him. I caught a ride with Dennis, figuring I'd call Allan once we got to the president's house and let him know where I was. The party was everything I'd hoped. Intimate conversations about community issues, discussions about preserving Greek culture for the next generation, planning for future events. I felt valued, included, important. These people respected my opinions, appreciated my insights, treated me like I belonged. The evening flew by. We talked about everything: family histories, cultural traditions, community politics. I felt more intellectually stimulated than I had in months. Dennis was particularly engaging, sharing stories about his photography work, documenting Greek communities across the country. He understood the importance of preserving our cultural identity in ways that Allan never could. I kept meaning to call Allan, but the conversations were so engaging and my phone kept acting up. Besides, he was probably at home watching television by now. He'd understand once I explained what an important evening this had been for me, how meaningful these connections were for my sense of cultural identity. It wasn't until Dennis offered to drive me home that I realized how late it had gotten. The ride back was comfortable. We continued our conversation about Greek culture, about the importance of maintaining traditions, about the challenges facing our community. Dennis was so easy to talk to, so understanding of the cultural pressures I'd been dealing with for years. When we pulled up to my building, I felt reluctant to end the evening. It had been so long since I'd had conversations this meaningful, connections this deep. Dennis seemed to understand exactly what I'd been missing in my marriage, that cultural component that Allan had never been able to provide. We sat in the car for a few minutes, continuing our conversation. Dennis was telling me about other Greek communities he'd photographed, about the different ways families maintained their heritage. It was fascinating, and I didn't want the evening to end. When he leaned over to kiss my cheek goodbye, a traditional Greek farewell, it felt natural, comfortable, right. I was still floating from the evening when I got upstairs. Finally, I'd found my people. Finally, I'd spent an evening where I didn't have to explain or translate or accommodate. Finally, I'd been valued for who I really was, not just as Allan's Greek wife. But Allan was waiting for me on the balcony, and he did not look happy. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, before I could even get through the door. I was still buzzing from the wonderful evening I'd had, still feeling culturally fulfilled in a way I hadn't experienced in years. His angry tone immediately put me on the defensive. "I was at the after party," I said. "I told you I needed to talk to a few people." "You told me 15 minutes, he snapped. "That was 6 hours ago." 6 hours? Had it really been that long? The evening had flown by so quickly, filled with such meaningful conversations. The time just bowed away from me, I explained. "You should have seen how engaged everyone was in discussing community issues. These are important conversations, Allan." But he wasn't interested in hearing about the cultural significance of the evening. He started interrogating me about Dennis, about the ride home, about why I hadn't answered my phone. His jealousy was so obvious, so ugly. After 31 years of marriage, he still didn't trust me. He still couldn't understand that some things were more important than his need for constant attention. "You disappeared with another man," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You ignored my calls all night. You came home at 5:30 in the morning. What am I supposed to think?" The accusation was so ridiculous, so insulting. I was networking within my cultural community, I shot back. something you've never understood because you've never bothered to really become part of it. He stared at me like I'd slapped him. Your cultural community? Lindsay, you abandoned me at a public event to go off with some guy. People were asking me where you were. That's when I realized what this was really about. His pride, his ego. He was embarrassed because people had noticed I'd left without him. And now he was trying to make me feel guilty for finally having an evening that was about my needs instead of his comfort level. Maybe if you'd made more of an effort over the years to actually integrate into Greek culture instead of just tolerating it, you would have been invited too, I said. The look on his face was pure shock, like he couldn't believe I was finally being direct with him about the fundamental problem in our marriage, his complete inability to truly join my world. I've been to every single Greek function with you for 31 years, he said quietly. I've tried to learn the language. I've supported your cultural activities. I've never complained about spending our weekends at Greek events instead of doing things I might enjoy. But that was exactly the problem. He saw it as supporting me instead of embracing something that should have become part of him too. After 3 decades, he was still an outsider looking in, still treating my culture like some hobby he was indulging rather than something that had become part of his family's identity. Trying isn't the same as succeeding, I told him, and supporting isn't the same as participating. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at me. Then he said, I'm going to stay somewhere else for a while. We need some space to figure out what's happening here. I watched him go back inside and start gathering his belongings. Part of me wanted to stop him, to explain that the evening had been about cultural connection, not about him. But another part of me felt relieved. Finally, I wouldn't have to manage his feelings about my Greek activities. Finally, I could pursue the cultural connections I'd been craving without worrying about whether he felt included. The next few days were strange. Allan ignored my calls and texts completely, which seemed like an overreaction to one evening out. I tried reaching out to our kids, but they said they didn't want to get involved in whatever was happening between us. Even Lucas, who usually took my side in family disagreements, seemed distant when I tried to explain the cultural importance of the networking I'd been doing. Then the divorce papers arrived. Divorce papers, after one evening of cultural networking. After 31 years of marriage, he was throwing everything away because I'd finally found people who appreciated my Greek heritage the way he never had. I called him immediately, but he wouldn't take my calls. I went to his office, but security wouldn't let me up. He was acting like I'd committed some terrible crime, instead of simply engaging with my cultural community in a way that didn't revolve around his comfort level. The papers cited irreconcilable differences and abandonment of marital duties. Abandonment! I'd spent one evening focused on my own cultural needs instead of managing his social anxiety, and suddenly I was abandoning our marriage? I tried talking to our friends, explaining what had really happened that night, but somehow the story had gotten twisted. People were acting like I'd done something scandalous, instead of simply attending a cultural event where I felt valued and understood for the first time in years. Even within the Greek community, people started treating me differently. The warm reception I'd received at the afterparty seemed to have cooled. When I called Dennis to ask about upcoming community events, he was polite but distant. Apparently, word had spread about Allan filing for divorce, and people were uncomfortable with the drama. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Allan's lawyer painted me as some kind of unfaithful wife who'd abandoned her husband at a public event to carry on with another man. They made it sound sordid and cheap instead of what it really was: a cultural awakening, a reconnection with my heritage, a chance to finally be appreciated for who I really was. My own lawyer kept asking me questions that made it sound like she didn't believe my version of events either. So you spent 6 hours at this after-party and never once called your husband to let him know where you were? And you came home in another man's car at 5:30 in the morning? And you see nothing inappropriate about this behavior? Inappropriate? I'd spent an evening engaging in meaningful cultural discourse with people who valued my heritage. I'd finally felt intellectually stimulated and culturally connected in ways my marriage had never provided. If that was inappropriate, then maybe the problem wasn't with my behavior. Maybe the problem was with a marriage that had never allowed me to fully be myself. The kids started taking sides, and it wasn't the way I'd expected. Connor, my youngest, stopped returning my calls altogether. Lucas would still talk to me, but our conversations were strained and formal. They seemed to believe Allan's version of events, that I'd somehow betrayed the family by pursuing cultural connections that didn't include him. "Mom," Lucas said during one particularly difficult phone call, "Dad's been nothing but supportive of your Greek activities for as long as I can remember. He learned enough Greek to get by. He attended every single community event with you. What more did you want from him?" But that was exactly what they didn't understand. Getting by wasn't the same as truly participating. Attending wasn't the same as belonging. Supporting wasn't the same as embracing. After 31 years, Allan was still a tourist in my cultural world, and I was tired of being his tour guide. The divorce was finalized 8 months later. Allan got the house. Apparently, the judge was swayed by his lawyer's argument that I'd abandoned the marital home by staying out all night. I got half of our other assets, but had to find my own place to live. The Greek community that I'd thought would embrace me seemed to close ranks around Allan instead. Apparently, his decades of quiet participation and respectful attendance had earned him more loyalty than my lifetime of cultural authenticity. People who had welcomed me warmly at the afterparty now gave me polite but distant nods at church functions. Dennis stopped responding to my messages entirely. The meaningful connection I'd thought we'd made evaporated as soon as the divorce became public. It turned out that his interest in cultural discourse didn't extend to getting involved in messy personal situations. I found a small apartment across town and tried to rebuild my social life. But the Greek community here is smaller than you might think, and word travels fast. My reputation had been damaged by the divorce, by the circumstances that led to it. By the way, I'd supposedly abandoned a devoted husband for another man. Dating at 53 after 31 years of marriage was harder than I'd expected. The men my age were either still married, recently divorced themselves and dealing with their own baggage, or looking for women significantly younger than me. The cultural connection I'd craved seemed less important to potential partners than I'd hoped. My relationship with the kids remained strained. They maintained contact with Allan, spending holidays at his new place, calling him regularly. With me, they were beautiful but distant. They'd check in occasionally, ask how I was doing, but the warmth was gone. They saw me as the one who'd broken up the family, who'd thrown away a good marriage for reasons they couldn't understand. 2 years after the divorce, I ran into Allan at the grocery store. He was with a woman I didn't recognize. Not Greek, not particularly striking, but she was smiling at him in a way that suggested they were more than friends. She looked comfortable, content, like she belonged exactly where she was. Allan saw me and nodded politely. "Lindsay," he said, "how are you?" "I'm well," I lied. "You good?" he said. "Really good." And he looked it, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. The woman with him squeezed his arm gently, and I could see the easy affection between them. It was clear that whatever he'd found with her was working better than what we'd had. I wanted to feel angry about it, to find something wrong with the picture they presented. But the truth was, they looked happy together. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy, in a way that Allan and I hadn't been for years. After they left, I stood in the cereal aisle trying to process what I'd just seen. This was what Allan looked like when he wasn't constantly trying to fit into a world that didn't quite accept him. This was what he looked like when he could just be himself without cultural translation or accommodation. The realization hit me harder than I'd expected. All those years I'd spent frustrated with his inability to fully embrace Greek culture, he'd been equally frustrated with my inability to accept him as he was. I'd wanted him to become something he wasn't, while he'd simply wanted me to love him for who he was. But even with that realization, I couldn't bring myself to admit that I'd been wrong. The cultural connection I'd craved was real. My need for intellectual and heritage-based stimulation was valid. If Allan couldn't provide those things, then maybe we really weren't compatible after all. The problem was I hadn't found those things elsewhere either. The Greek community that I'd thought would embrace me had turned out to be more loyal to consistency than to authenticity. My cultural heritage, which I'd thought would be my ticket to a richer social life, hadn't translated into the meaningful connections I'd expected. I still attend Greek functions occasionally, but as a peripheral figure now instead of a central one. People are polite, but distant. I'm the woman who left her devoted husband, who caused a scandal, who chose cultural networking over family stability. My reputation precedes me in ways that make genuine connections difficult. The apartment I live in now is smaller than the house Allan and I shared, but it's mine. I've decorated it with Greek artifacts and cultural items that reflect my heritage. It's beautiful and authentic, and exactly what I thought I wanted. But it's also quiet in ways that the house never was. Empty in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd handled that evening differently. If I'd insisted that Allan be included in the after-party invitation, or if I'd chosen to go home with him instead of pursuing the cultural connection I'd craved. But then I remember how alive I felt that night, how valued and understood, and I can't bring myself to regret it entirely. The truth is, I got exactly what I said I wanted. I'm free to pursue cultural connections without having to accommodate someone who didn't fully understand them. I can attend Greek functions without managing anyone else's comfort level. I can speak Greek all evening without having to translate or include someone who is always half a step behind. But what I didn't realize was how lonely that freedom would be. Cultural authenticity, it turns out, isn't worth much when you're experiencing it alone. Heritage and tradition are meant to be shared, and sharing them with people who truly understand is meaningless if those people don't actually want to build real relationships with you. Allan found happiness with someone who accepts him as he is. The kids have moved on with their lives, maintaining relationships with both of us, but clearly preferring the stability he represents. The Greek community has continued without me, valuing consistency and loyalty over the cultural passion I thought would make me indispensable. And I'm here in my authentic Greek apartment, surrounded by cultural artifacts that remind me daily of everything I thought I wanted and everything I actually lost in trying to get it. The silence is deafening, and the cultural connections I craved have proven to be far less fulfilling when they come at the cost of everything else that mattered.
If this confession kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We share powerful true stories every day that explore the complex realities of life.